Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 1, Halacha 1, and we have three direct mentions in the Torah about the sabbatical year. Now, the word Sheviis means the seventh, and the Shemitah itself means to release something. So, this idea of Shemitah, it's showing that we're releasing control of the agricultural produce. Also, any debts that we have are also going to be released during the seventh year. There are a few ways to categorize Sheviis. First of all, you have with the land. There's certain agricultural activities you're not allowed to do. Then you also have with food. There's certain produce that you're not allowed to sell. You have to leave it over for the poor people to take, or even the animals and the beasts of the land to take. It's free and open to everybody, even the animals, to eat. And then the last thing is that the debt, if you have debt that is, it's very specialized on how this works, but it's not like capital loans for a business. It's just a loan that somebody makes. Of course, non-interest loans. Jews give non-interest loans to other non-Jews, or to non-interest loans to Jews, and that those are waived. Now, there's a lot about that comes up in the end of the Masechet. And just as a note, Hillel the Elder instituted the Prose Bowl. That's a debt instrument that's recorded with a bet din, so that if you did make a loan, that it would not be waived. But there's a lot about that. It's very complicated. We're going to be covering most of the beginning of Masechet Sheviis is about the agricultural organization of the land and those activities. Then we're going to get into the food. Then we're going to get into the debt. That's the structure of the Gemara. Now, real quick, here's one of the scriptural passages. There's a few of them. You have over in Exodus 23:11, Leviticus 25, that's 1 through 8. And also in Beurim 15, 1 through 11. Now, let me read the one from Leviticus. It says, Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel. There's a lot of clue, by the way. Anywhere you see where it says the children of Israel, there's a clue that this is for Jewish people, and it's going to come up later. What about Sheviis produce? Is that going to be where it has sanctity for a non-Jew or not? It's going to be covered later. So it says, speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land, so as we see that this is a mitzvah for the land. And it says that for the land I am giving you, the land shall observe a Shabbos rest to Hashem. Now there's a lot in the word about a Shabbos rest. So that's going to come up as well. The Shabbos rest is referred to as the seventh year. And it says, 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather in its produce. But the seventh year there should be a complete rest for the land, a Sabbath to Hashem. Your fields you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. The aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you set aside for yourself you shall not pick. It shall be a year of rest for the land. The uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat, for you, for your slave, for your maidservant, for your laborer, and for your resident who dwells in your land. That means a ger tzedek, and somebody who's observing the 7 Noahide laws. And it says, and for your animal and the beast that is in your land shall all its produce be to eat. That means that if you have wild animals there, you have to leave it for the wild animals, also for your own animals. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind. What do we see in this passage? We see here talking about your vineyard. Well, we also see a field you shall not sow. Well, two kinds of fields, right? We were covering this in Masechet Peah. You have a field of trees, and you see that right here with a vineyard. So it could be a field of grapevines. And then you also have a field of grain. And so we're actually going to be getting into that chapter 1 is going to cover the field of trees first, and then chapter 2 is going to cover for the fields of grain. Now, there's some differences between the fields of trees and the fields of grain. One of the things I leave to you is, why is it that dafka in the organization of this, that the fields of trees are going to be coming first in the Masechet, and the fields of grain are going to be coming second. So that's going to be a mystery for us to unravel together. One of the key things that's not mentioned specifically in here is the act of plowing. I mean, we see reaping and we see picking, but we don't see we don't see actively. We also see sowing, right? But we don't actively see plowing. Now, you have this biblical work that is prohibited, right? Sowing, pruning is in there, reaping, picking. But what about plowing? Now, in Exodus 34:21, it says, "From plowing and reaping you shall desist." So there's going to be an argument that comes up between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. Everybody's going to agree that during the 7th year, you are not allowed to plow. But Rabbi Akiva is going to say it's Doraita, and Rabbi Yishmael is going to be saying that actually this is going to be a halacha Moshe l'Sinai. That's going to come up as a theme many times throughout that. Now, there's another thing to keep in mind. By the way, the Tosafot says that it is actually Doraita. Also, Rashi, the Rosh, they also say that plowing during Sheviis is also going to be a biblical thing, but it looks like the Yerushalmi is actually going to be on the view of Rabbi Akiva, on the view of Rabbi Yishmael, that's going to be a halacha Moshe l'Sinai. So that's a thing to pay attention to. Everybody agrees you're not allowed to do it during. Okay. Now, there's another thing. We have time frames, right? So, it starts Rosh Hashanah. The Sheviis year starts Rosh Hashanah. Now, there are certain activities that are prohibited beforehand. Why would that be? Well, because you are doing certain things that during the 7th year would be improvements to the land and would make the land be improved. Now, we're going to be covering that in the beginning. So there's an organization to the Masechet, and the Masechet's going to start off talking about trees, and it's going to start talking about, in a way, the most logical thing possible. That is going to be plowing, since plowing is not specifically mentioned in that verse in Leviticus, and it's going to be talking about the work before Rosh Hashanah. Everybody agrees you're not allowed to plow during. Plowing is an odd thing in that because that in Leviticus is not specifically mentioned. It's mentioned elsewhere as a forbidden labor. But what about beforehand? In other words, we know that Rosh Hashanah, that's when Sheviis starts. But what about plowing the field beforehand? And is that going to be forbidden? And when would that cutoff be on when you're allowed to plow, and up to what point you're not allowed to? When does this Sheviis prohibition that occurs before Sheviis actually start? Mishnah says, "Until when may one plow in a field of trees in the year before Sheviis?" And Bet Shammai says, "As long as it is good for the fruit presently growing in the field." But Bet Hillel says one may plow until the festival of Shavuot. Now, we're going to be covering later on in this Gemara the origin of this, and the idea is that we have this pre-Sheviis prohibition, and it depends on the kind of field. So most fields are going to be fields of grain. That's when you think about a field, you're thinking about fields of grain. And if you were to plow them earlier, that is going to be because you are trying to help out a future growing season. Okay, so that's going to be the idea of why you're not allowed to plow a field of grain beforehand. In other words, you're tilling it so that you can get the soil nice and soft. You're tilling it to get weeds out and to bury the seeds of weeds, and also to bury any seeds from the crop that may have dropped. Perhaps you're going to be changing the field so that you were growing wheat and now you're going to grow barley. You don't want wheat mixed in there. So what the plowing does is it buries everything under so that it's not viable anymore. And also what it does is it generally oxygenates the ground. We've learned a lot about earthworms in the scientific world, and it turns out that earthworms are fantastically good for soil. Why? Because they oxygenate the soil. They bring oxygen into the soil, and it helps the root cultivation, and it helps everything to grow because of a chemical thing going on with the growth of the plant. So too, if you're plowing the field, you are bringing oxygen into the soil, and that's going to help your future growth. So we see here that in that kind of field, you're really doing it for the future planting of a field. But for an orchard where you have a field of trees, plowing them, well, that's going to help the trees to grow, but it's really also going to help to preserve the moisture content of the soil, and that makes it so that the moisture content of the soil is going to help to preserve the trees and also make the fruit better. In other words, a lot of this fruit might ripen sometime in July or August, for instance, like in peaches. Peaches really get ripe in the second week of August, and as in Eretz Yisrael, that's the prime part, and that certainly is going to be about a month before Rosh Hashanah. So if you're plowing it at this certain time, it's going to help it after the rainy season has come and the rains have stopped. You're going to be basically creating a situation where there's more moisture in the soil, and it's going to help with the current crop to grow. So there's a difference between the plowing for a field of trees and for a wheat crop or a grain crop. And the idea is that as long as the plowing is going to benefit the produce of the sixth year, there's no problem for it. And that's the idea of plowing for a field of trees. You're trying to do it to preserve the water content. And when you had this water that's in the ground during the rainy season, you're trying to get it to penetrate more deeply under the surface. It's a way to try to save the water from evaporating and drying out, and you're trying to get it into the surface of it. And once the ground dries out in the hot summer sun, plowing is actually gonna be bad for a tree. So the idea is that he's not really preparing it for the seventh year, which you're not allowed to do. He's really doing it for the sake of the sixth year crop. Now, if a farmer were to go plow the field later in the summertime, that would be a problem because it would look like and probably be a case where he's trying to prepare the ground for the seventh year, because you wouldn't do that for trees. You'd be ruining your trees and fruit. So the Mishnah ends off and it says, and the words of these and those are close to being like the words of these. In other words, the opinion of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are almost identical, and Shavuot is close to the time when plowing is going to cease to benefit the fruit. That's the idea. In other words, Bet Shammai, Bet Hillel, they both agree that plowing is forbidden once it appears to be done for the sake of the seventh year. The deadline is going to be a little bit different, and that's going to vary year to year. And Bet Hillel says that it's fixed and an unchanged deadline, and Bet Shammai is going to say it's going to vary from year to year. That's the basic difference. We're going to get into the exact difference on, what does it mean that, Bet Shammai's deadline is going to be close to Shavuot, but not exact, and we're going to get into that. So, again, this is covering plowing before and in the organization of all this for fields of trees. Fields of grain will be chapter 2. Now, something to keep in your mind is that what's going on with plowing before. And we're going to be getting into that. Now, the Gemara is going to repeat what the Mishnah said, which is, until when may one plow a field of trees? So the Gemara is going to present a source for the ban against plowing before Sheviis. Now, the following is going to be an elaboration of the Mishnah in Halacha 3, and that's going to be by the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And you can also find a parallel on that in the Bavli in Rosh Hashanah 9a, also Moed Katan 3a, Makot 8b. But this is Sheviis, and here's what it says. It says, "It is written, 6 days you may do your work, but on the 7th day you shall desist." And it is written elsewhere, "From the plowing and from the reaping you shall desist." Now, this is from Exodus 23:12, and then the later verses in 34:21. And it's interesting to see why the former verse is going to be quoted here, and it fails to play a direct role in the following discussion. Some commentators actually delete it from the Gemara and insert the beginning of the verse in 34:21 into this place. But nonetheless, this is what's here in this edition. So the Gemara says, how do we explain the latter verse, this verse at the end? And the Gemara says it refers to the Sabbath of creation. That's going to be Saturday. And the idea is that this would be consistent with the first part of the verse, which speaks about the Sabbath. This idea of the Sabbath is coming up. And the Gemara says, but is it not already stated, 6 days may you work and perform all your labor, whereas the 7th day is a rest for Hashem your God. You shall not perform any labor. This, by the way, is in Exodus 20, Pasuk 9 and 10. And then the Gemara is going to be answering. What it's trying to do is trying to prove on this, is it talking about on the Shabbat day itself, you're not allowed to do the labor like plowing and reaping? Well, we know that on Shabbos you're not allowed to do work, specifically as one of the malachot during Shabbos, like plowing and reaping. So what is going on here? We have a Shabbos mention over on the day of Shabbos. We also have a Shabbos mention on the year of Shabbos. So we're trying to figure out what kind of work is going to be forbidden. And the idea is that the Torah already forbade work on the Shabbos. In other words, we know that the Gemara is going to be arguing that since all forms of work are going to be forbidden on the Shabbat, the Torah does not single out plowing and reaping during the day of Shabbat. So it has to be talking about the year of the Shabbos, which is the Shemitah year. That's really what it's trying to get at. So the Gemara continues and says, and if it refers to the Shabbos of years, that's the Sheviis, but is it not already stated, 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard, whereas the 7th year, your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune, and aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you had set aside for yourself you shall not pick. Again, this is Leviticus 25, 3 through 5. And it says, in the case of Sheviis, the Torah had already forbidden reaping. In other words, if this is just talking about the Sheviis year, well, we know that reaping is already forbidden. It's written explicitly about the Shabbos of years, and reaping is in that sentence. So it can't be talking about that. So what's it saying? And the Gemara continues and says, rather, since it does not refer to the Shabbos of creation, and it does not refer to the Shabbos of the years, apply it to the prohibition of the 2 early periods. In other words, it says it's trying to teach that plowing is going to be forbidden from the Pesach or Shavuos before Sheviis. Here's the point, okay? The point is, in the case of an orchard, it's going to be Shavuot. That's going to be according to Bet Hillel. And in the case of a grain field, cutoff date is going to be Pesach. Now, that's going to come up in chapter 2. But the idea is that we're trying to get into this pre-Sheviis ban on plowing. And as you know, as we've read before, that in one of the key verses in the Torah, plowing is not mentioned. And also what is not mentioned is the work to prepare the field with plowing that would improve it for the 7th year. Well, it's not explicitly written that you shall not plow before the Sheviis year. And that's why chapter 1, Halacha 1, in Sheviis is starting off talking about and deriving this pre-Sheviis work of plowing. Not of reaping, not of plucking, not of pruning. Those are explicitly mentioned. But this is the work that comes before the Sheviis year that would improve things for the 7th year, that you could do it on the 6th year, and that is what they're trying to derive. They're showing this is not singling out pruning and reaping for the day of Shabbat that you have every week. No, it already forbids all work, not just reaping and pruning. It doesn't need to be singled out for the Yom Shabbat. Really, this is trying to prove that you're not allowed to plow. Well, we agree, you're not allowed to plow during Sheviis, but what about the work before that would improve it? And that's what it's trying to derive. Now, this is the proof that it's using, and this is how it's trying to do it. So the idea is, under biblical law, this prohibition is going to apply only for the last 30 days before Sheviis, but the rabbis advanced the beginning of the prohibited period to Pesach and Shavuot, and then you have this agreement between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael that you're not allowed to plow before Sheviis. However, the way they're going to derive it is going to be different. One is Rabbi Akiva is going to hold that it's a direct obligation. Rabbi Yishmael is going to hold it as a halacha Moshe Sinai. And both, by the way, agree. Also, you're not allowed to plow on Sheviis itself. They also agree not before. Now, the idea is that, we have this phrase, it prohibits plowing before the Sheviis. And the Gemara is going to cite a brisa which teaches us how the words of the phrase should be read. Okay? So this idea is where it says, but, we're looking at it. In the case of Sheviis, it says, rather, since it does not refer to the Shabbos of creation, it does not refer to the Shabbos of years, apply it to the prohibition of the 2 early periods. In other words, that in this verse that we read over there in Exodus 23:12, where it says, 6 years you may sow your field, 6 years you may prune your vineyard, whereas the 7th year your field you shall not sow, your vineyard you shall prune, so on and so forth. Okay, what this is saying is Gemara says, since it does not refer to the Shabbos of creation and does not refer to the Shabbos of years, you're applying it to this earlier prohibition of the plowing beforehand, which would be for the benefit of the field on the 7th year. And the Gemara is going to show how to read this. And the Gemara says, when the Torah states, from the plowing and from the reaping you shall desist, it means one must desist from a plowing whose reaping is forbidden. And the Gemara continues, and it says, and what is this plowing whose reaping is forbidden? This is an act of plowing done before Sheviis, but which enters Sheviis. In other words, the idea is that this plowing that you're doing before the Sheviis year is going to have a benefit on the seventh year. And just like you're not allowed to reap on the seventh year, you're not allowed to go get your scythe and start cutting grain on the seventh year, because that's doing the work on the seventh year. So too, the plowing that you're doing just before the seventh year for the benefit of the field on the seventh year, it's effectively like it's doing work on the seventh year because it's benefiting the growing and the field. And the Gemara says, and when the verse mentions reaping, it refers to a reaping whose plowing is forbidden. And what is this reaping whose plowing is forbidden? The Gemara says that this is an act of reaping that could be left done on Sheviis. Thus, the plowing is forbidden, but it was left until after Sheviis. So the idea here, for example, is that grain that attained at least a third of its full growth during the seventh year, but it's not harvested until the eighth year, although it was not harvested during Sheviis, it must be treated like produce of Sheviis because you were able to harvest it then. So too, like an etrog, if the etrog started to grow on the Sheviis year, and then you actually plucked it on the eighth year, well, that would be treated like Sheviis produce because it was growing during then. So the idea is that grain would acquire the Sheviis sanctity, and you could not use it for commercial transactions, and it would also be subject to Beur and everything else. So the idea is that this Baraisa is referring to the eventual reaping of the grain like that, where it would say reaping whose plowing is forbidden, because it is certainly forbidden to plow on Sheviis for the sake of the grain. So that's going to be how the Gemara is recommending this to be read. There's some dispute on that, but this is the opinion of this Baraisa. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it says, our Mishnah and the previously cited Baraisa clearly forbids plowing before Sheviis, and the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, but if so, why was it stated that we may plow until Rosh Hashanah, which is the first day of Sheviis? Now, the sages of the Gemara know that plowing is permitted until the beginning of Sheviis, and the Pnei Moshe says about this that this permit appears in a brisa cited below, and the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to answer. And Rabbi Crispy says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabban Gamliel and his court permitted the prohibition of the two early periods, Pesach and Shavuot, that precede Sheviis, and they ruled that one may plow an orchard after Shavuot and a field of grain after Pesach until Rosh Hashanah. So the idea is that Rabban Gamliel and his court were the ones who permitted the working of the land until Rosh Hashanah. So this is very curious what's going on. And the Gemara now is going to question Rabban Gamliel's authority to override this pre-existing prohibition of not doing the work before, as we were talking about. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan asked, but have we not learned in a Mishnah, a later court cannot abolish the edicts of another earlier court unless it is greater than the earlier court in wisdom and in number? In other words, Rabban Gamliel's court, they're saying, was not greater than the court that establishes prohibition, so how could they abolish it? That's really what they're saying. Well, where was this prohibition enacted? It was enacted by Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. They both were the ones who enacted it. So how can they do it? And it seems to be raising a problem. But Rabbi Yochanan brought up the problem, and he's also going to bring the answer. So the Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Kruspe says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, when the rabbis enacted the pre-Sheviis prohibition, again, this is Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, they stipulated that if sages of a later generation seek to let the people plow, they may annul the prohibition and let the people plow. In other words, the court of the earlier generation had in mind a condition. And they had in mind the condition that if the time would be where the people of that generation would need to plow up to that point, that they could do it. And who is the one who has the virtue to do it? It would be Rabban Gamliel. It's not just any court. Okay, so the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question, because the obvious question is, well, what is this Mishnah even talking about, right? Why is this even in here? And, the Mishnah is going through a lot of work, and that Bryce is going through a lot of work to try to prove that you're not allowed to plow after the Shavuot period of time. So why, it's been repealed. Why bring it up? So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, but if the pre-Sheviis prohibition was repealed by Rabban Gamliel, then let it be uprooted from the Mishnah. In other words, since this prohibition had ceased to be relevant by the time of the Mishnah, why did they put it into the Mishnah? And in other words, it would seem that the rulings should have been removed from the Mishnaic text, should not have been handed down. The Rambam says about this that Rabban Gamliel mentioned here was Rabban Gamliel of Yavna, and he held the position of Nasi shortly after the destruction of the temple, which took place more than a century before the Mishnah was completed by Rebbe. So that's something to keep in mind. And the Gemara is going to answer, why was this left in the Mishnah if this was repealed? The Gemara answers. It says, Rabbi Kruspe says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, these rulings were preserved in the Mishnah so that if the sages want to reverse themselves and reimpose the pre-Sheviis prohibition, they may indeed reverse themselves. In other words, if later sages wanted to come along and do it, they don't need to be greater in wisdom or number. They have a basis for which to reimpose it. So the Gemara is going to also question. It's going to say, let them, be removed from the Mishnah, is based on this premise that the Mishnah records only that which is relevant in practice. In other words, is it saying that, it's only relevant Mishnahs that are going to be recorded? And this premise is actually going to be challenged and demonstrated as not necessarily being true. Rabbi Yonah challenged it and says, but there's a passage of the Miluim. This is going to be a Mishnah that's going to be talking about the Miluim, which is a period of the 8 days where the Mishkan is inaugurated, and it's going to show the series of offerings. And these offerings are subject to special rules that did not apply to any other offerings. And the point is, this is still recorded. And why would that be? In other words, if this was only for a one-time thing, for an 8-day period of time, and no other time, why record it? And the Gemara says, and there is a passage of the generation of the flood, which are not going to return, yet they are also discussed in the Mishnah. In other words, there's another Mishnah in Menachos in 7.2, also 7.3. You can find that in Bavli 78a, which deals with the laws of the Miluim offerings. And in that Mishnah, in Sanhedrin in 10.3, Bavli 107b, it's talking about whether the generation of the flood is going to merit a portion of the world to come. And the idea is now you're talking about people who are long gone, that, what's the status of these people before the flood in terms of Shemayim and world to come and resurrection of the dead. And the Gemara continues and says, now if you are going to say that they should be removed from the Mishnah because they are no longer relevant. Rather, these events were recorded in the Mishnah in order to inform you of them. And so here, the pre-Sheviis prohibition is recorded in this Mishnah to inform you of it. So, would it be possible later to reimpose it? Yes. But by recording the pre-Sheviis prohibition, the Mishnah is teaching how the rabbis decreed the laws to prevent biblical commandments from being violated. That's really the deep idea here, says the Rosh Cirilio. And the Gemara is going to give a third reason why the pre-Sheviis prohibition is going to be recorded in the Mishnah. And Rabbi Mana said, this can be explained on the basis of that which we learned in the Mishnah elsewhere. This is referring to Idios 1:6. Idios is the book of the disputes between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, where Bet Shammai is actually going to be lenient in all situations, and Bet Hillel is going to be strict in all situations. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. That's going to be what's unusual about that. So if you have a case where Bet Shammai is lenient in all situations but one, that would not be recorded. It has to be in all situations. So the Gemara is going to say, Rabbi Mana said that this could be explained on the basis of that which we learned in the Mishnah elsewhere. It's going to be an idios, and the opinion of the individual who argues with majority is recorded in a Mishnah, although the halacha follows the majority. And so the Gemara says, so that if a person will say, thus I have received a tradition from my teacher, they can answer him, it is in accordance with the words of so-and-so that you heard your tradition, but his was a minority view, and the majority disagreed with him. In other words, there is no record, if there's no record of the minority opinion, and somebody comes along and says that he received this opinion from his teachers, people might consider it to be the authentic halacha and the halacha lemaisa. But the reason the Mishnah is recording the minority view as well is so that we can explain to him his tradition and that it does not represent the accepted halacha, but rather an opinion that had been rejected. That's the concept that Rabbi Mana is trying to articulate. And the Gemara continues and says, similarly, in a case, if someone says, I have heard that it is forbidden to plow in the 6th year before Rosh Hashanah, they can tell him, you heard about the prohibition of the two early periods, that would be Shavuot and Pesach, which was enacted by the rabbis of a former generation, but has been later annulled by the court of Rabban Gamliel. And in the Gemara above, Rabbi Yochanan explains that Rabban Gamliel had the authority to annul the enactment of the early court because the initial law contained a provision that allowed him to do it. That's the idea. And the Gemara is going to present a different explanation. Rabbi Acha says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, when the rabbis prohibited plowing before Sheviis, they relied upon a derivation of Scripture. And when Rabban Gamliel and his court permitted it, they also relied on a derivation from Scripture. In other words, they were looking at an asmata to do it, and there are other cases in the order of Zerayim that talk about how when things are done with an asmata with a scriptural source and proof, it hardens the argument. And the Gemara is going to explain this. It says, when they prohibited plowing before Sheviis, they relied on a derivation from Scripture as explained in the Brisa quoted above. And the verse says, from the plowing and from the reaping you shall desist. This is in the Torah. And this is teaching that one must desist from a plowing whose reaping is forbidden. And what is this? In other words, what is a plowing whose reaping is forbidden? That's the question. And the Gemara answers and says, this is an act of plowing that was done before Sheviis, but which enters Sheviis. In other words, it benefits the produce that one is forbidden to reap on Sheviis. In other words, you're not allowed to reap on Sheviis on the 7th year. You have that grain pile, that grain standing there, you're not allowed to reap it. And what this is trying to say, here's a Doraita explanation showing, as an asmata, that if you're plowing to improve the ground before and that grain has been improved, well, when are you reaping it? You're reaping it on the 7th year, which is forbidden. And so it's trying to show a reaping whose plowing is forbidden as well. And the Gemara is going to say, what is a reaping whose plowing is forbidden? And what is this? A reaping whose plowing is forbidden, it asks. And it says, this is an act of reaping that it could have been done on Sheviis, and thus its plowing is forbidden because it was left until after Sheviis. This is a case where it could have been done on the 7th year. In other words, the grain grew to 1/3 ripeness. You could have cut it on the Sheviis year. But instead, you left it to grow into the 8th year, and it's still going to be Sheviis produce because the initial growth of it up to the age of being ripe enough to harvest was actually going to be on Sheviis year. And so what it's saying is, it's saying a reaping whose plowing is forbidden, and the other is going to be a plowing whose reaping is forbidden. So one is going to be the case of plowing before the 7th year and harvesting on the 7th year. That is forbidden. And the other case of a reaping whose plowing is forbidden is going to be where it grew, the grain grew at least 1/3 on the 7th year, and you didn't go and harvest it until the 8th year. That's going to be left until after Sheviis. Now, the Gemara is going to get into the argument on Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai to help explain it. But first, the Gemara is going to present Rabban Gamliel's derivation. And the Gemara says, and when Rabban Gamliel and his court permitted plowing before Sheviis, they also relied on a derivation from Scripture. In other words, they looked at an asmata for it. And they said, it is written in Exodus 29, it says, 6 days you shall work and perform all your labor. And this is an analogy between the Shabbos and Sheviis, where they both constitute a period where one would be a day and the Sheviis period would be a year of rest. And in other words, both would be with 6 periods of work. In other words, either you have 6 days of work or 6 years of work. And Rabban Gamliel is inferring from this analogy to make this asmata, just as on the eve of the Shabbos of creation, which would be a Friday, you may perform labor until the sun sets at the end of the day. In other words, that's going to be a malacha, and that's going to be a labor that's forbidden on the Shabbos, and that's going to be, permitted until sunset on Friday evening. And it says you may perform a labor until the sun sets at the end of the day, and so too on the eve of the Shabbos of years, which would be on the 6th year, you may perform labor until the sun sets on the last day of the year. In other words, this is saying, just like on Shabbat, you can do a forbidden labor just before the sun sets if you did not take Shabbos in early, so too there's no pre-Sheviis prohibition where plowing would be permitted up until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. And Bet Hillel ruled in this Mishnah that Shavuot is going to be this fixed deadline for plowing on the 6th year. And the Gemara is going to explain Bet Hillel's reasoning. It says, but why, according to Bet Hillel, may one plow in the 6th year until the festival of Shavuot? And the Gemara is going to answer and say, because until then, plowing is good for the produce of the 6th year. But after that point, it damages the 6th year produce. And now the Gemara is going to challenge this and is going to say, but we learned in a Mishnah below that the deadline for plowing on the 6th year, as debated by Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel applies to both a non-fruit-bearing tree and a fruit-bearing tree. So if this deadline is based upon the tree's ability to make fruit, then why would that apply to non-fruit-bearing trees? Well, in the case of a non-fruit-bearing tree, plowing should be permitted until Rosh Hashanah of Sheviis. So that's basically going to be the counter argument. The Gemara is going to answer that a similar consideration applies in the case of plowing for non-fruit-bearing trees. And it says, until this time of Shavuot, plowing thickens the trunk of the tree. But from that point on, it weakens the tree's strength. So in the case of non-fruit-bearing trees, plowing is permitted only until Shavuot. So why would you care about the thickening of the trunk of the tree? Well, you can use the wood from that trunk and use it to make beams for a house and use it for construction. They're talking about trees that could be used for wood, for building. And so in both cases, you would be benefiting the tree. The Gemara now is going to look at why the Sheviis prohibition would apply to both non-fruit-bearing trees as well. In other words, it makes sense for fruit-bearing trees, but why do you have a prohibition for non-fruit-bearing trees? And one of the things about that is you say, well, we know that, famously Sheviis produce is going to have, a funny status, that you can't waste it and things like that. It's subject to Beur, and it's generally dealing with food or dyes and animal food. But what about for building, for beams and wood? And that would be for a non-fruit-bearing tree. And the Gemara answers, it says, but since this one does not plow such trees for the sake of cultivating produce, one should be allowed to plow the land around them in any case. And the Gemara answers and says, since one realizes that plowing after Shavuot weakens the tree's strength, he too intends to plow only for the sake of working the land. In other words, the Vilna Goan says, since plowing after Shavuot is harmful to a tree, one who does so must have a different purpose in mind. And what would that be? Says the Mara Fulda, that he intends to plant fruit-bearing vegetation around the tree later. So working the ground for the sake of growing produce, we know is going to be prohibited. So that's going to be one answer. In other words, why would he be plowing this? Well, he might be plowing it to try to do something with fruit-bearing trees later on. Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, since one realizes that plowing after Shavuot weakens the tree's strength, he too intends to plow only for the sake of working the land. In other words, that we know that plowing after Shavuot is harmful, but why would that be? And he's intending to plant fruit-bearing trees. That's the point. He's intending to work the land to grow something else. And the end of the Mishnah states that the words of these and the words of those are close, like to each other. In other words, the opinion of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are almost identical. And in the Mishnah, Bet Shammai is saying over there that plowing is allowed as long as it benefits the fruit presently growing on the tree. And Bet Hillel gives a hard deadline, and that's going to be Shavuot. So what would that be? Well, Gemara is going to assume that Shavuot is going to come slightly earlier than the time that Bet Shammai is saying. And so in that case, Bet Shammai would be a little bit lenient. So the Gemara is going to ask. It's going to say, but why was this dispute not taught in Masechet Idios, where you have, again, this Masechet is talking about the leniencies in all cases of Bet Shammai and the strictnesses in all cases of Bet Hillel. It looks like in all cases this is going to be strict according to Bet Hillel and lenient according to Bet Shammai. And the Gemara asks and says, why was this dispute not taught in the Masechet Idios among the lenient decisions of Bet Shammai and the stringent decisions of Bet Hillel? And the Gemara answers and says, Sometimes the rains are infrequent and moisture is not found. And in this kind of situation, plowing beneath a fruit tree is detrimental to the fruit even before Shavuot. And should one wish, says the Gemara, to plow before Shavuot, according to Bet Shammai, he is forbidden to do so. Whereas Bet Hillel would say that he may continue until the festival of Shavuot. And in this one particular circumstance, Bet Shammai is more stringent than Bet Hillel. And because of that, this is not in Masechet Idios, which is only talking about the case where in all ways Bet Hillel is more stringent, and in all ways Bet Shammai is more lenient. So the idea is, what about the plowing that happens before? And we know that this was annulled or repealed, and it could be reinstated later on. And we've been covering the plowing that is coming before the Sheviis year, and trying to understand why Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, both of them, instituted it. So we're going to get into Halacha 2 tomorrow, which is going to be talking about the field of trees before Sheviis and the law of plowing around the trees, and what's going to be a field of trees. So have a great day.